Chapter 1. The Silence of the Snow. The winter of 1914 had settled into the bones of Flanders like a slow-acting poison. In the British sector near Ypres, Lieutenant James Stirling stood knee-deep in a mixture of freezing slush and grey mud. To his left, Sergeant Miller was trying to light a damp cigarette, his fingers shaking not from fear but from a cold that seemed to ignore the thick wool of his greatcoat. "Quiet night, sir," Miller whispered, the smoke from his cigarette barely visible in the frigid air. "Too quiet. Makes my skin crawl." "It's Christmas Eve, Miller," James replied, his voice raspy. "Maybe the world is finally tired of screaming." For months the landscape had been a cacophony of the rat-tat-tat of Vickers guns and the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of distant howitzers. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy velvet silence draped itself over the trenches. The artillery fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly a sound drifted across the waste, not a scream or a shot, but a melody. High and clear, the German lines were singing Stille Nacht. "Is that singing?" a young private named Tommy asked, leaning his head over the parapet. "Get down, you fool," Miller hissed, but he didn't pull the boy down. He was listening too. The hauntingly beautiful sound pierced the frozen air. Then a British voice, hesitant at first, joined in. "Silent night, holy night." Within minutes, the two lines were engaged in a choral duel. "They're not half bad for Huns," Miller grumbled, though James saw him wipe a stray tear from his cheek. Chapter 2. A Light in the Darkness. The singing didn't stop with one carol. Soon the Germans were shouting greetings. "Englishmen, we no shoot, you no shoot." James watched in disbelief as small, flickering lights appeared along the German parapet. They were tiny fir trees lit with real candles, Tannenbaums. The sight was surreal, a fairy tale image superimposed on a graveyard. "It's a trap, sir," Miller warned, his hand tightening on his Lee Enfield. "They'll wait for us to pop our heads up and then let us have it." But James looked through his periscope and saw a lone German soldier standing atop the trench. He wasn't wearing a helmet, just a soft cap. He held a small tree in one hand, and his other hand was raised high and empty. "I'm going out," James said, his voice surprising even himself. "Sir, that's suicide," Miller protested. "If it is, at least I'll die doing something decent," James replied. He scrambled up the wooden slats and onto the frozen earth of no man's land. Every instinct told him he was walking to his death, but as he stepped forward, he saw a German officer approaching from the other side. They met in the middle, amidst the craters and the jagged wire. The German officer was tall, with a thin moustache and eyes that looked just as tired as James's. "I am Lieutenant Friedrichs," the German said in clipped English. "Lieutenant Stirling," James replied. They shook hands, a simple, human gesture that felt like an explosion in the silence of the war. "Merry Christmas, Friedrichs. And to you, Stirling. Tonight perhaps we are just men." Chapter 3. The Beautiful Game. By Christmas morning, the grey wasteland between the trenches had been transformed into a marketplace of humanity. Men who had spent weeks trying to kill one another were now swapping jam for sausages and cigarettes for buttons. "Oi, look at this!" Tommy yelled, pointing toward the German line. A German corporal named Klaus emerged, dribbling a tattered leather ball through the frozen mud. The sight was so absurd that a cheer went up from both sides. Without a formal command, the soldiers began to clear a space. They used their heavy wool coats and steel helmets to mark out goalposts. "We play!" "Yes!" Klaus shouted, his face beaming. "You're on, Fritz!" Miller yelled back, shedding his greatcoat. "Stirling, you're in goal!" The pitch was a nightmare of frozen ruts, shell holes and discarded tins. But as the ball was kicked off, the identity of the soldiers blurred. There were no Huns or Tommies anymore, just young men breathless from exertion. The match was chaotic. There were no referees, and the rules were whatever worked at the moment. When a British soldier tripped over a German, they would both scramble up, laughing and slapping each other on the back. The ball, heavy and waterlogged, didn't bounce well, but it flew through the air like a symbol of defiance against the death that surrounded them. Chapter 4. Klaus and the Lieutenant. During a break in the play, James sat on an overturned ammunition crate next to Klaus. The German corporal was huffing, his face bright red from the cold and the exercise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. "My Anna," Klaus said, showing James a picture of a woman with a small child. She is 3. I have not seen her since the leaves were green. James pulled out a silver cigarette case, a gift from his father. She's beautiful, Klaus. I have a girl back in London, Sarah. She thinks I'm a hero. If only she could see me now playing football in a crater. Klaus laughed, a deep belly laugh. We are the same, yes? You have a home, I have a home. Our kings and kaisers tell us to hate, but I do not hate you, Sterling. You are a terrible goalkeeper, but I do not hate you. James grinned. I'm an excellent goalkeeper, you're just a lucky striker. They shared a piece of hard chocolate, the sweetness a sharp contrast to the metallic taste of the front lines. Around them, men were showing off pictures of their mothers, their dogs, and their sweethearts. In that small circle of warmth, the war felt like a distant, bad dream. Chapter 5. The Fading Truce. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the cold deepened. Rumours were reaching the front that the brass at headquarters were furious. Orders were being whispered down the lines. The fraternization must end. I think the game is over, James said, standing up. Klaus nodded solemnly. The match? Who won? I think we did, Miller chimed in, though he had a German cap perched sideways on his head. 3-2! Lies, Klaus shouted with a wink. It was 3 for us, but we let you feel good because it is Christmas. The soldiers began to drift back. There were final handshakes and promises that would be impossible to keep. James and Friedrichs met one last time. Sterling, Friedrich said, his voice low. Tomorrow, if my men fire, it is because they must, not because they want to. I know, James replied. Tell your snipers to aim high. We'll do the same. As James lowered himself back into the British trench, the candles on the German trees were beginning to gutter out. The magic was leaking out of the air, replaced by the familiar, heavy scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Chapter 6. The Echo of the Miracle. The day after Christmas brought the return of the snipers. A single shot rang out at dawn, shattering the peace of the previous 24 hours. The miracle of Christmas was over, buried under a fresh layer of snow and the renewed thunder of artillery. James Sterling survived the war, though he carried the scars of the Somme and Passchendaele. Decades later, as an old man in a quiet London suburb, he would sit by his fireplace every December. He kept a single tarnished brass button in a velvet box, a gift Klaus had cut from his own tunic that day. He told the story to his grandchildren, who looked at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Did you really play football with the enemy, Grandpa? We weren't playing with the enemy, James would say, his voice thick with memory. We were playing with friends we hadn't met yet. The uniforms were different, but the hearts were the same. He knew that the world had tried to forget the truce, calling it a myth or a lapse in discipline. But James remembered the weight of the ball, the sound of Klaus's laughter, and the way the candles looked against the snow. The guns eventually won the war, but for one day in 1914, humanity had staged its own quiet revolution. And in the heart of an old soldier, that miracle never truly ended.